afternoon, everyone. This is a great-looking crowd. I'm Gretchen Crosby Sims, the Executive Director here at the Institute of Politics. We are so honored to welcome former Secretary of State John Kerry to campus today to talk about confronting the climate crisis, moderated by our own David Axelrod. I'd like to say a quick thank you to our partners at International House, particularly the Global Voices program, for making this event possible. I do want to mention a few upcoming events. Next Monday, Texas Congressman Will Hurd will be talking to former IOP fellow and Atlantic writer McKay Coppins. Congressman Hurd is on the House Intelligence Committee, so it's sure to be a timely conversation. The Monday after that, the 21st, Admiral Mike Mullen will share his perspective on the future of U.S. relationship with Afghanistan in a conversation moderated by Jennifer Griffin of Fox News. Tuesday, October 22nd, we will continue the climate change conversation with Tatiana Schlossberg of the New York Times as she examines whether so-called conscious capitalism can in fact save the planet. For more information about these upcoming events and others, please visit our website at politics.uchicago.edu and sign up for our newsletter. Our website is also where you can get involved with UCHI Votes, a nonpartisan voter engagement initiative with an eye on boosting registration and turnout around the 2020 elections. Audience questions. We will have questions after the moderated conversation. There will be two mics, one in the center aisle and one on the side aisle. Line up there, and please remember that everybody is welcome at the mic. So first years, we want to hear from you. The Q&A period is a cornerstone of our programs, and we encourage everybody to come up and ask questions, though we remind you that the first 3 questions are reserved for students. Please make sure that your phones are on silent. And here to formally introduce our speaker is Kate Quinn. Kate is a 4th year from Philadelphia studying political science. During her time at UChicago, she has been involved in the speaker series and the fellows program at the IOP. Please join me in welcoming Kate to the podium.
Good afternoon. I am truly honored to have been given the opportunity to introduce one of the greatest public servants of modern times. His legacy is one of unquestionable integrity, patriotism, talent, and an unshakable commitment to the welfare of all Americans. To be frank, it is a challenge to include all of his achievements in this short introduction, but notably, John Kerry served in the Vietnam War, earning several medals, including the Silver Star, and then went on to become one of the most foremost voices advocating against the Vietnam War and for American accountability. After finishing law school, he went on to serve as Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts and then a U.S. Senator from Massachusetts. In 2004, John Kerry won the Democratic nomination for president, and despite losing the general election, he would later serve as Secretary of State, in which he achieved innumerable diplomatic successes. Today, Secretary Kerry has become one of the most powerful voices advocating for climate change legislation. Beyond his resume, one particular trait of the Honorable John Kerry shines through: his ability to inspire hope. When John Kerry ran for president in 2004, I was an angry, frustrated, and most of all scared 6-year-old raised in a deeply Quaker family. As I watched the Iraq War unfold across the news and the TV each day, I looked to John Kerry and his campaign as a beacon of hope, as an individual with the ability to lift us above the violence and chaos we witnessed as a nation every day. I am proud to say that John Kerry's presidential campaign catalyzed my own passion for public service. I began as an opinionated blonde 2nd grader, stumping for the Kerry campaign to anyone who would listen to me. And now I find myself as an undergraduate at the University of Chicago, working as a large dollar fundraiser for Red to Blue campaigns. Secretary Kerry continues to be a beacon of hope for us all, rising above the chaos and uncertainty of our current political climate to create a more perfect union. Today's conversation will be moderated by IOP Director David Axelrod. Before he returned to his alma mater of UChicago, Mr. Axelrod was a senior advisor and chief strategist to President Barack Obama. And without further ado, please welcome David Axelrod and the Honorable John Kerry.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate. 6 years old, huh? 6 years old. It's impressive. Yeah. You should have elevated her to the upper echelons of your campaign. You might have won.
I should have put her in charge of Ohio. It made the difference.
Welcome, Mr. Secretary. Great to have you back here again. I know that you are devoting a great deal of your time to the climate change crisis, and as we sit here, the wildfires are burning in California, and the seas are rising, and there's evidence all around us of why it's such a crisis. But before we get into that discussion, there are a few things going on, and I wanted to ask you about them. The first is in northern Syria and Turkey. This has been an extraordinary week because the President of the United States had a conversation with President Erdogan, and he summarily withdrew American troops from northern Syria and exposed the Kurds to the Turkish attack that then ensued. Talk to me generally about that sequence of events and what you think the impact of them will be.
David, thank you. Let me begin, first of all, by saying thank you to all of you. Thank you for coming. Thank you, David, for inviting me. Kate, thank you for a wonderful introduction and for being there when it mattered. I really appreciate it. And I also want to begin by saying to all of you that I'm really here, apart from wanting to see your bright faces this morning on a rainy day, because of this guy. And I have so much respect for David Axelrod and love what he's doing with the IOP. But he asked me to come, and for weeks and months he was patient, and I'm really honored to be able to be here with him.
So that's the first lie you've told. I wasn't patient.
He was patient. I gave him cause for patience. So, look, this has been the worst fall in American history. But I'm not going to say more about the Cubs and the Red Sox. I'm going to move on to other things. It's really disappointing. It's hard to be out of it. And
it's too easy.
Yeah. I don't know. So listen, Syria is the great open wound internationally. It represents a shocking failure of the international community to get to Geneva and negotiate an outcome going way back to 2011, 2012. And this war has gone on and on and on. And to some measure, in my judgment, because there's just an absence of leadership on an international global level from the UN, from presidents of countries, that is imperative to be able to try to deal with this. And now, to complicate matters further, our president has made a judgment based on nobody really quite knows what, but certainly not on a legitimate internal White House national security process being properly effected, on the whim and fancy of a phone conversation with a man who has been, frankly, problematic to our interests for some years now. There's a reason ISIS was a problem. And part of that reason is Turkey, because they didn't shut the border. Oil was being sold across the border. There were all kinds of problems, and we actually had to turn to the Kurds to become our compatriots in this battle against ISIS. And the Kurds put themselves on the line. The Kurds, from the Treaty of Sèvres and the Treaty of Lausanne in the 20s, the end of the Ottoman Empire, the end of the World War, the world was divided up. And they were promised they were going to get a nation. There are 30 to 40 million of them. They live in Iraq, in Syria, in Iran, and in Turkey. They are ethnic Iranian. And their search has been legitimately for their territory they were promised by the world. Now, things don't always work out, I get it. And there are a bunch of Kurds who are acting as a militia, the Syrian Defense Force that was part of our battle against ISIS. And I'm telling you this bluntly, we could not have done what we did with the minimal loss of American life had the Kurds not been our instrument in that fight. And it was a pure strategy. We worked it hard. We worked it with the Turks. And don't think for a moment that it didn't present serious challenges with respect to our politics at the time. Erdogan would say to us, and my counterpart, the foreign minister, would say, you guys are supporting terrorists. And we'd say, no, that's the PKK, and they're in your country. These guys are militia who are living over here, and they've secured the border, and they're essential to us. So what you are witnessing, folks, is an incomprehensible, shocking betrayal by one person, not a decision by the military. The military is deeply opposed to this decision, but by the president and his own deal, whatever it is, with Erdogan on a phone conversation. And that's why even Republican senators are so angry about this at this point in time. So I pray we will not witness a genocide. But where do you begin to measure how many lives are lost to actually be doing ethnic cleansing and to actually be engaged in at least the beginning components of that? It's tricky. And this is going to cost us. This decision by the president reinforces the decision already made by the president not to fire back and deal with Iran with respect to the attack on the Saudi facilities, which has created recalculation in the minds of the Saudis, the Emirates, the Emiratis, others in the region, and it particularly has to raise questions in Israel, where people are going to be saying, whoa, wait a minute. They're not willing to, the president wouldn't stand up to what happened in Saudi Arabia, he won't stand up to the Arab world, and now he pulls out and allows this incursion into Syria, which tightens the noose around Israel, and which simultaneously provides Iran with a greater access to the land bridge that it's always been seeking in Lebanon. So this is really dangerous stuff. And I hope it won't stand. The president's trying to have it both ways for a change. And criticize them and say, we're going to do sanctions, but on the other hand, say, no, it's not going to be this terrible unfolding, which it obviously is, because he gave them a green light. Our troops were what stood between that. And we're just going to have to see, David, how it unfolds in the days ahead, but it's very, very costly to us and to our credibility in the region.
You mentioned our troops. You were speaking earlier about the impact on them, having fought side by side with the Kurds and now having to stand down as...
Yeah, well, you can imagine. I mean, I've been there, done that. I know what it feels like when you're in a country and you're carrying a gun and you're licensed to kill other people in that country, and you're working with a certain group of soldiers, and if all of a sudden the people you're working with who live and die with you are told, you tell them, hey, I was sleeping in the tent with you last night, but I'm gone as of tomorrow, and you're on their own. By the way, Turkey's going to invade and try to kill you. How do you feel? You feel like you've been betrayed personally. You feel like you don't understand your country. You feel like you have to question, what is this keeping faith with the people who died over here in order to create a diplomatic outcome and to create order and structure rather than a free-for-all at the mercy of tanks and bombs and guns? It's a terrible feeling, and I feel sorry for those guys because they have to be angry and befuddled at the same time and deeply disappointed in their commander-in-chief. You mentioned that there's been bipartisan protest about this, and presumably Congress could take some sort of action to rebuke the president, but you can't really unring the bell here, can you? No. I mean, the president has that kind of power in terms of foreign policy and command of the military. And people have to obviously, you either obey the orders or resign, and some have resigned over the course of the last months. But in this case, those orders are being carried out for the time being. And
You mentioned you didn't know what his motivation was. Who are the beneficiaries in geopolitics of this decision,
well, he
other than the Turks?
Yeah. He has not explained to people what the rationale was for it, except to say we shouldn't be in another war. We shouldn't have these people on the ground.
That has power, though, politically. Doesn't it have power?
I think not. I mean, yes, with some people, but I suspect not when you have such an obvious retreat from common sense with respect to our goals. We have a goal there. I'm not advocating, and nobody I know is advocating, that we have a whole bunch of American troops on the ground in an eternal war. But that's not what was happening there. A lot of American soldiers weren't dying every day, and very rarely now. This is not a hot war at this point. This was a place where we had staked territory, and people were respecting the territory. The Russians were respecting it. The Syrians were respecting it. Assad was respecting it. This was not, and it resulted in containing ISIS, with several thousand ISIS prisoners in prison. Who was guarding them? The Kurds. So those prisoners are now very likely to be released. Erdogan is threatening to flood Europe with refugees, so he's using human beings and refugees as a weapon against Europe to do this deed. It's really messy. Folks, diplomacy matters. There's no diplomacy here. I haven't seen anything over the course of the last months been attempting to bring people to the table in Geneva the way we did. I chaired an entity called the International Syria Support Group, together with Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia. We would sit there side by side, and we came up with a peace plan for Syria. It involved a democratic election. It involved a sharing of power in the government. It was supported by the Iranians, the Egyptians, the Turks, the Russians, the United States, the Saudis, the Emiratis. Everybody came together around that table. And it wasn't easy to get Iran and Saudi Arabia at the same table. That's diplomacy. There's been none of that. You pull out of the Iran deal, and the foreseeable and foreseen occurs. You have conflict in the region. Ships being shot, another one today, and tensions rising. That was foreseeable. That's exactly why we negotiated the deal. We negotiated the deal to get a nuclear weapon off the table and to prevent us from going to war. At a time, and David will remember this, where King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia was as close as I am to David, and he said to me, "You have to bomb Iran." That's what they understand. And I went to visit Mubarak, and Mubarak said to me, "You have to bomb Iran." And the Prime Minister of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu, actually visited the White House and asked President Obama for the green light to bomb Iran. The president said, "Wait a minute, we got to try diplomacy here before we start another war." So folks, we were on the brink of going into conflict when I sat down with Zarif, the first Secretary of State to sit with the foreign minister of Iran in 40 years. Now, I learned one thing, a big thing in Vietnam. Before this country of ours sends the sons and daughters of American families off to fight a war in any country in the world, make sure we understand what's going on in the country we're going to, and make sure we have exhausted the remedies of diplomacy. That's a given. And that is not what has occurred here. There's been almost no diplomacy, but a lot of rattling about a war.
So let me shift to a more sedate topic, impeachment. As we speak, the former ambassador to Ukraine, Ambassador Yovanovitch, is testifying before the Congress. She was removed from her position in May. She testified that she was told by the Deputy Secretary of State that she was being removed at the instance of the president, but for no no reason related to her performance. And she said that Rudy Giuliani had been provoking the president for reasons she didn't know. And she went on to say that she's a career service of, you knew her.
She worked with me. I knew her and worked with her, and I have the utmost respect for her. She's a real professional and very capable Foreign Service officer.
She talked about, and let me see if I can quickly put my hands on what she said. Her testimony was released, even though this is behind closed doors. And she said, today we see the State Department attacked, hollowed out from within. State Department leadership with Congress needs to take action now to defend this great institution and its thousands of loyal and effective employees. Are you concerned about the State Department?
Yes, very much so, sure. There's been a hollowing out of the department. Very experienced people. I mean, most recently, Brett McGurk, Tom Shannon, who was the counselor and then political affairs. I mean, they're gone. So there's been a loss of experience, which is obviously takes time to build up. And many positions aren't filled. Many of the assistant secretaries of state are not filled at all. Key ambassadorships are not filled. So we're flying by the seat of our pants. People in other countries don't know who to call in certain cases. They don't have the kind of interaction that is critical to daily diplomacy and to formulation of policy. So yeah, I'm deeply concerned about it, David, and I think I would take I perhaps edit your comment about they don't, we don't know exactly what the president was doing. I think we do know what the president was doing. Marie, the job she was doing that they objected to was actually getting at corruption. And she, like everybody else in our administration, was trying to wean Ukraine off of its level of corruption. And we went all out in that endeavor so that the fight of the Maidan and the death, the 100 people who were shot by snipers from the roof, and I was there early days after that and walked through the Maidan and in those streets, saw the rubber tires burning and the smoldering still, and the passion of this revolution to to win their country back from Yanukovych, who was stealing it. And Marie was trying to further that, the transition, which is why we wanted to get rid of the prosecutor. That wasn't Joe Biden who wanted to do that. That was us. It was the whole team, because the prosecutor wasn't prosecuting. And so that's what Marie was doing. And what happened is Marie just wasn't cooperative enough in helping to leverage the president to get Joe Biden to be the target of this country. That's why she was fired. So we do know really what went on. I think that's going to come out in the course of the next days. President Trump got rid of her and says she's a bad person because she wasn't acting the way he wanted her to leverage making Ukraine the opposition research arm of his reelection campaign.
Should he be impeached?
Well, that's got to be decided by all the evidence that comes in. But look,
based on what you've seen, it seems like you're making a case here.
Well, I'm a former prosecutor. My instinct is to make the case. But
could you make a case based on the evidence that you've seen so far?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, the law, I think it's the statute is U.S. Code. I think it's the 52 U.S. Code 13021 or something like that, with an A and a 2 in parentheses.
There's some law students out here who are going to run and check that out.
Go for it. And it says definitively it is against the law to solicit assistance in a campaign from another country, from outside sources. Solicit, let alone receive, get, et cetera, or to leverage. So the solicitation is in the president's own words. I want you to do me a favor. Which comes, if you look at the paragraphs, there was no business conducted in this call. except for the president reminding the president of Ukraine how much we had done for him, how much he'd done for him. I mean, you can see the setup of this call, folks. Every person with common sense. Oh, Mr. President, congratulations. By the way, you congratulated him on the wrong thing. You're supposed to congratulate him on the parliamentary election. Congratulated him for his election. So the call didn't start very well. And then you got into paragraph 2 or 3, and all of a sudden, he's talking about a favor, and it keeps repeating itself. No question about Russia. No question about how's the war going. No question about how we're going to stand with you against Putin. Never said the word Putin. So you ask the question, who stands to gain from all of this? Putin and the authoritarians and the oligarchs, the people that we were trying to go after in terms of that corruption.
Let me just ask you, your successor, Secretary Pompeo, it turns out was on that call. First of all, is it unusual for him to be on a call like that? And secondly, what should he have done?
Well, it would depend on what the purpose of the call was, whether or not you'd be on the call. I was, I think, very rarely on a call where the president was in the Oval Office or in the White House, and I would be on the call.
You'd get a readout after.
I would get a readout. I often was in the room or on the phone when we were traveling somewhere, and the president might be on the phone. I can remember a call specifically with Putin like that, and Susan Rice and I were both in the room and sharing that. But that would have been recorded, by the way, who was there and everything else. You get a full readout on it. The readout, by the way, that the White House issued is not a full readout. It has ellipses in it. That's not the normal way in which readouts come. If there's something that's unintelligible, it's not a ... It's, laughter or unintelligible is actually printed there, but no ellipses.
Or inconceivable, would they put that?
Yeah, or inconceivable. So look, folks, I'm not here sitting here.
But you didn't answer my question about Pompeo. People were sort of stunned when it turned out he was on the call.
I think it's a little surprising. I can't tell you why. I don't want to make a judgment about it.
But what should he have done, having heard what he heard?
Well, I would have. I mean, if I'd heard something like that, I think I'd have done a memo to the file right away, and I might have conversed with White House counsel and said, "Hey, this is a serious problem." Now, obviously, the White House moved to address that serious problem.
He may have done that because they moved the thing to a classified file.
Well, that's what I was about to say, that the White House moved that conversation and other conversations to a highly classified server, which had nothing to do and rightfully would not have been the place where this kind of a call would have been placed, because this call did not involve national security directly in terms of the conversations or classified information. It was moved there, obviously, so that people would not have access to it. And now they're preventing people from having access to it, which, as Adam Schiff has said, can be interpreted as another obstruction of justice count. Remember, Robert Mueller did not, when he was asked in testimony before the Congress, did your report exonerate the president on any of these issues of obstruction of justice? Mueller said no. It did not exonerate the president. And the only reason that 1 or 3 or all of those obstruction of justice components of Mueller's report, the only reason they did not result in an indictment, according to Mueller, was because the policy of the department in a memo written was that you can't indict a sitting president. But Congress could do something with it. And now Congress has it under its purview in May. Just yesterday, 17 prosecutors involved in the Watergate prosecution issued a public letter saying that it was their judgment that this is an impeachable offense, and comparing it to Watergate found it even more egregious. So this has yet to unfold, folks. I'm not going to sit here and make the impeachment judgment, but absolutely, positively, the Congress of the United States is correct to pursue a preliminary investigation to make the determination.
Just a couple more things on this, and then I want to get on to climate. What's so funny about that? I don't know. The conventional wisdom is that the House may well impeach the president, and it seems like it's headed in that direction, and that your old colleagues in the United States Senate will then acquit him, and we will move on to an election. You said that you're not as sure of that as the conventional wisdom would suggest.
I'm not. And from the evidence, nor is President Trump, who apparently is calling Mitch McConnell 3 times a day. I think that you cannot measure this by where it is today. In Richard Nixon's impeachment proceedings, the majority of the country didn't decide that he should be impeached until 2 weeks before he resigned. And that was after the hearings with Sam Erwin and John Dean and all the things that occurred that built up that pressure. Today, right now, according to a Fox poll, 52% of Americans believe he should be impeached. So you're already in different uncharted territory. And I'm not saying this is going to happen, I'm not predicting, but I am saying this: in the culture and the nature of the United States Senate, where I spent 28 years, having to vote is a very different animal from having a possible investigation and commenting on that and way ahead of time. When the evidence is in, when the case is there, if it is there, if they were to impeach and there is a trial, you have a very different situation, and the eyes of the world will be on us. And this has to be about the Constitution of the United States, not a party, not a president, not an ideology, but the Constitution. And this is very much on the line, folks. If subpoenas are going to be just dismissed out of hand by the person being subpoenaed, who in America is going to say, I should honor a subpoena in the future? Where's rule of law? If a president of the United States can say, I could shoot somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue and nobody would care, and that is ratified because nobody cares, where are we? Our democracy is at stake in this. Make no mistake about that. And whether the judiciary stands up when it has to rule on access to the subpoenas, stands up the way the Supreme Court stood up on the Nixon case and said those tapes have to be made public. That was the ruling. Now, we don't have those kinds of tapes here, but we have a lot of evidence here. And undoubtedly, the courts are going to play a role in this. So every one of you, I think, should hope desperately that what our founding fathers put together, the institutions of our nation, are going to be honored in this process. Because if they're not, it's very difficult to come back from that abyss. Very difficult.
Last question on this. When I watched the president speak, and he spoke again last night, and he's hammering away at this notion of corruption by Joe Biden, corruption by his son, even though that has been debunked again and again. It reminded me a little bit of 2004, when you were running for president, and a group called Swift Boat Veterans for Truth embarked on a campaign to sully your war record. And everyone said, John Kerry was a hero, no one's going to buy this. But the fact is, it had a corrosive effect over time. Will the president's, are you concerned as a Democrat that the president's just relentless hammering, because he's got a bigger megaphone than the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth had, that will have a corrosive impact on Biden? And what should he do about it?
Well, I think he did the right thing the other day. I think he gave an outstanding speech. It was a very hard-hitting speech. I think it was very honest, very direct. But I think he's got to keep repeating it. He's going to have to bang away. The mistake we made in 2004 was that judgment, that the allegations were all countered by my record being made public, by the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, blah, blah, blah. They all ran front-page stories writing about it and setting it straight. And this was sort of a novel event in terms of fake news. And the miscalculation was that it's been answered. And the problem is when television is pounding away at it and Now we have a whole new set of platforms in the social media. So that's just not enough, period. And it was a bitter lesson, obviously. We should have run ads. We should have counted it every day. We should have been out there in their face and calling them out on it. And I think if we'd done more of that in the month of August, we could have won the presidency in that month, to be honest with you. But that's retrospective. You know, hindsight's 20/20, right?
But the lesson for Biden is to be
The lesson
aggressive.
for Biden is to pound away, to go right back at it, not let them have an inch. Don't let up. Keep pointing out where the corruption is today. Keep pointing out who it is who's told X number of thousands of lies to the nation. And keep pumping out there the findings that have shown that he did no wrong, and that you've just got to pound away at it. I believe the American people ultimately will latch on to the truth. I believe that. But you've got to force feed it. You've got to be out there. And we have to recognize that we're living in a very different world now in terms of information. I mean, my colleague in the Senate, Pat Moynihan, had a wonderful saying: everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. The problem in America today, and it's not just America, it's around the world. I mean, Mark Twain used to say, a lie can get halfway around the world before the truth gets its boots on. Now a lie can get all the way around the world in a nanosecond. Push a button. And so who are the arbiters? Who are the referees? If you read a book called How Democracy Dies, you will see in there that one of the steps to the diminution of democracy is you eliminate the referees. And to a certain degree, President Trump has been doing that steadily, browbeating them, bullying them, scaring people, terrifying the rest of the senators who fear a primary more than they fear a general election. So this is a trying moment for us, folks. How do you reestablish the baseline of truth, which is essential to a democracy? And if your democracy is going to work, you've got to be able to build consensus up around choices, consensus around climate change, consensus around trade, consensus around healthcare, and what our approach is going to be. That's a democracy. Right now, we don't have any debate like that. We don't have any real discussion. We have a shouting match, polarized, ideologically divided, and dangerous for this nation that we love. I remind you what Benjamin Franklin said when the Founding Fathers finished their work in that hot summer in Philadelphia. He walked down the steps, and a crowd had assembled to learn what they had done, and a woman shouted at him, "Dr. Franklin, what do we have? A monarchy or a republic?" And he said, "A republic, if you can keep it." Well, let me say a word about that. You know what the eligible voter turnout was in 2016 when Trump got elected? 55.6%. When I ran, it was 62.1, and when Obama got elected successfully, it was 63.7. Get the message? 9% of Obama's vote went to Trump. 7% of Obama's vote didn't even come out. And you know what the young voter turnout was in 2016? People who have a stake in climate change, people who have a stake in education that's affordable, and run the list, 19%. So who's to blame for where we are? We got to get our asses in gear. We got to go out and win back. And by the way, we've done it. I know this works. When I first came back from Vietnam, before I protested the war, I was involved in Earth Day, 1970. You know what we did? We turned out 20 million Americans in one day, people who didn't want to live next to Love Canal or toxic waste site or the Woburn dump. We turned them out, and we turned them into a political movement. We targeted the 12 worst votes in Congress, labeled them the Dirty Dozen, and we beat 7 of the 12. You know what happened? The survivors said, "Oh my God, this is a voting issue." Even Richard Nixon said that. And we passed Clean Air Act, safe drinking water, marine mammal protection, coastal zone management. We created the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States. We didn't even have one. And Richard Nixon signed it into law and tried to co-opt this movement. You go look at his State of the Union of that year. So it works. Make it a voting issue. And I'll tell you what I'm about to do. We're going to announce, I'm already been saying this a bit on TV. Arnold Schwarzenegger, former governor of California, who did a lot on climate. Christy Todd Whitman, former governor of New Jersey and EPA director. Ernie Moniz, former energy secretary of the United States, myself. We're starting something called World War Zero. And we are going to involve people around the planet who are going to demand accountability on climate change. It's a war because the naysayers, the deniers, the distorters literally have declared war on you, on all of us. We got people dying in the United States of America from mudslides, from fires out in California now, from floods, from heat, from storms. And people who have turned their back on climate change, I think, are almost criminally negligible and accountable for what they're doing to America and to the world. We are 15% of the world's emissions, and we need to do something about this fast. So I feel powerfully about this, and what we got to do is go out and make climate and all the choices of energy policy and oceans and infrastructure that go with it, they have got to become an organizing principle going into 2020. And if we do the right thing, turn out enough voters on that issue, we're going to win back the future of our country. And that's what we got to do, period.
So I forget what question I asked, but that segue was a professional segue right there. So let me ask you
Trying to get off this impeachment stuff.
No, that was experience in action. The question is how you create that sense of political urgency around climate change. You know, Jay Inslee, the governor of Washington, ran on this issue. And it turned out to be sort of a cameo appearance in the presidential race because he couldn't mobilize, a movement behind this candidacy. All the candidates have climate positions, but none of them, you can't really point to one of them and you'd say that is their issue. That's the one they're running on. And, now 4 in 10 Americans say that climate change is a crisis. That's up from a quarter just a few years ago. But I remember from our own experience that it was very hard to sort of mobilize people around climate change, even as we see evidence all around us of the degradation of the planet.
It's been, you're right on target. It's been difficult. I think that can change. I mean, it was difficult in the 1970s, early 70s, late 60s. You couldn't see across the city of New York. You couldn't see across Los Angeles. You were breathing air. Cuyahoga River used to light on fire. I mean, it was difficult, but it took those 20 million Americans coming out and then mobilizing politically to make the difference. Now, I think that could be done. I'm betting on it. That's what I'm trying to do, obviously. But we have to also talk a different language. And I love Jay Inslee. He's a terrific guy. I went out to Washington and tried to help him on his referendum on carbon pricing and so forth. I think you can't run just on the one issue. I think you have to be viewed as broader in terms of national security. Healthcare is obviously a huge concern. The inequity in our country is an enormous concern. The anger people feel today is palpable, and everybody feels it, right, left, center, liberal, conservative, and we ought to be speaking more to that anger. I mean, when 51% of the income of our nation is earned and goes to 1% of the country, we have a fundamental societal fabric that is not tenable, folks. That is not a politically sustainable equation. And that's beginning to bubble up. The problem is that Donald Trump tapped into that and has faked it to enough people that they think he's actually fighting for them. So we got to be better at how we communicate on this. I think on climate change, health is an extraordinary issue. The largest cause of children being hospitalized in America every summer is today environmentally induced asthma. You are asked to spend $55 billion a year to deal with it. Bet you didn't know that. Most Americans don't. It contributes to cancer. It contributes to emphysema patients, to heart patients, to a lung. It's a problem. And we, about tens of thousands of people die prematurely in our country because of that. I think you could reach people on that. That's how ozone penetrated, because people thought they were going to get cancer, and ozone did penetrate. Then you go to the next thing. What about infrastructure in America? Can any one of you here name a major national infrastructure program that you're proud of? Oh, you can't name anything, because there isn't one. There isn't one. I went to China. I rode on a train that goes 300 miles an hour from Beijing to the coastline, and your water doesn't even move in your glass on a table. We have the Acela, which can only go 150 miles an hour for perhaps 18 miles of the trip from Washington to New York. Are you kidding me? We're the nation that invented the internet. We went to the moon. What is going on? Every $1 billion you spend on infrastructure is 27,000 to 35,000 jobs for Americans. If we were to seize the energy policy initiatives that are the solution to climate change, we can put tens of millions of Americans to work way into the future at good, high-paying jobs. You know the fastest growing job in America today? Solar power technician. Second fastest growing job in America today? Wind power turbine technician. 2 years ago, before Trump pulled out and did all that stuff, 75% of the new electricity in America, in our country, came from solar and wind. You know what coal was? 0.23%. So folks, that's the future. And I don't hear, frankly, enough of these people defining it in that context on a daily basis. That's how we make it a movement. I mean, are you happy being stuck in a 2-hour, 3-hour traffic jam every day to get to and from work and go to home? Hell no, obviously not. How many tons of emissions are we pouring up into the sky, not going anywhere?
So let me just interrupt you for a second, because we're going to take questions in a second. So if you have them, please line up behind this microphone in the center aisle. You mentioned until Trump, sort of in passing, until Trump pulled back. He's pulled out of the Paris Accord, and he's trying, although the courts are going to decide whether they'll move forward, he's pulled out of a number of the initiatives of the Obama administration, including fighting California and these other states on tailpipe emissions, which are a principal cause of climate change. How much impact have his decisions made in terms of setting back climate action?
Significant. Because we had reluctant participants in Paris in a number of nations. And now those nations, because of President Trump, realize there's no policeman, there's no big nation that's there to leverage the change. And the result is, David, that the last meeting of the parties for the UN was not very successful. And in fact, the United Nations meeting a week ago in New York was a disappointment in the upgrade of emissions reductions that people came in to announce. It just wasn't up to what we need. So the bottom line is, folks, no nation in the world is getting done what is necessary to win this effort. And I think you can mobilize people going out and talking about this and how we harness that energy.
Mm-hmm. With American leadership.
Absolutely. David, I saw it again and again. I mean, President Obama on Ebola, we were told 1 million people are going to die between September and December. And we didn't know what we didn't know. But President Obama had the courage to send 4,000 troops to West Africa. We built capacity. And in the end, with our leadership of bringing China, India, Japan to the table to provide supplies and people and so forth, we had a tiny fraction of that million pass away. And we stopped Ebola before it became pandemic. Mm-hmm. So American leadership, I mean, I've never seen, I say this, we get things done occasionally with Russia and China, but anybody here ever see Russia and China leading the charge in the UN Security Council? to hold people accountable to human rights or to genocide or abuses. No, we are that force. That is the privilege and the burden of being American. And we should carry it with humility, but we need to assert that leadership in order to keep faith with the values that brought us to this century where so many good things are in fact happening, and far, far fewer people are dying a violent death than at any time in human history. We've made some progress. When I was in college, severe poverty was 50%. Today it's below 10%. I could run a long list, I won't do it now, but I'm just saying to you, we've got to recognize what's worth fighting for here, and unfortunately this administration kowtowed to Putin in Moscow and Finland, and has moved America in the opposite direction from the one that I've just described.
So let's take some questions, and I'm going to say something impolitic, but can we sort of alternate men and women here in this line? Because so organize yourselves, will you? Yeah, well, I mean, you don't have to give up your first position there. Number 2 would have been fine. Go ahead.
Perfect. Secretary Kerry, my name is Aditya Shakar. First off, thank you so much for joining us. And on behalf of the American people, thank you so much for your decades of public service and service to our country. My question is kind of a broad one. How do you think future historians will conceptualize and look at this moment in history? 50 years from now, what will an AP US history class teach about 2018, 2019, 2020?
I personally believe, I am an optimist, and I do believe that we're going to correct this. And I think historians are going to look back on it and they will say this was an aberration that came about because not enough politicians and government generally was not functioning well and didn't respond to the felt needs of people. Donald Trump was perceived to be doing that despite all the warnings. He effectively, post-Gingrich Revolution, which failed, didn't deliver, post-Tea Party, which failed, didn't deliver, post-Freedom Caucus, which failed, didn't deliver, but got rid of 2 speakers, cost 2 speakers their jobs. Donald Trump effected a hostile takeover of the Republican Party based on the anger that I described earlier, and has now utterly failed in delivering on it. And I believe that historians will view this as really something that will be very hard to ever repeat again in our country if we do the right thing in our democracy and vote. 70% of Americans say that they are for dealing with climate change. If we just get that vote up to 65% or whatever, we're going to win this future back. And so that's the way I think they'll write it.
Thank you so much.
I'm just going to go, well, go ahead and then.
But depends on you.
Actually, I'm sorry. Let me take you and then I'll come to you. And
no, I've got a lot of people, so I want to try to be quick in my answers if I can.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for speaking as well. My name is Hannah Morin. I'm a 4th-year chemistry major. You've mentioned a lot of issues that the United States is facing today. Syria, right? Our democracy is at stake. In my 2 decades of experience with American governance, a lot of governing has become about putting out fires. So I'm wondering how we find the bandwidth among all of the political problems at home and abroad to tackle climate change. Where do we find that bandwidth? What persuasive tools beyond threatening people's seats do we have, especially for politicians who deny climate change?
Well, it's a really good question. I think I described that to a degree. I think the pluses of doing something about climate change so outweigh the cost that is coming to you of not doing it. We spent $265 billion cleaning up just after 3 storms. Harvey, which dumped more water on Houston in 5 days than goes over Niagara Falls in a year. Irma, which had the first sustained winds of 185 miles an hour for 24 hours ever recorded. And Maria, which devastated Puerto Rico. $265 billion. We are going to spend trillions of dollars to mitigate and adapt to what is going to happen with food production, water availability, refugees from climate. We already have them, by the way. They're going to be millions if we keep going the way we're going. And I think most Americans can latch on to that if it's properly described. And the alternative is to be creating jobs, preventing this disaster, and moving to a cleaner energy future, a healthier energy future, and a better economy for the United States of America. So I think it's a no-brainer ultimately, but I don't see it being put to people. One of the things World War Zero is going to try and do, if we can raise enough money, is we're going to do major advertising. We're going to do major micro-targeting. We're going to take the latest techniques, algorithmic and otherwise, and we're going to identify those climate voters in America, and we're going to help convert some that we think may be convertible and not waste our energy on a certain group of people who we're not going to get. But we can win if we get the majority. So that's how I think we do it.
Yes, I'm sorry. No time for follow-ups.
Okay, that's okay. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nathan Muntz. I'm a second-year medical student at the Pritzker School of Medicine. My question is, how do we provide environmental justice to communities of color and low-income communities that have been disproportionately affected by climate change?
Well, we have to win the battle of putting the policies in place that are going to deal with climate. But if you look at the Green New Deal, you look at the real Green New Deal that Ernie Moniz put out, you look at other proposals, everybody now has captured the responsibility to have climate justice. I mean, I'll give you examples. Diesel trucks now get detoured through the poorest sections of cities. That's one of the reasons why all those kids are hospitalized in the summer. So there are all kinds of connections of how dealing with climate falls on the poorest people around the world. And I think, whether it's the 17 development goals of the UN or the ESG efforts, the environment, social, and governance that corporations are now pursuing, there's a change in corporate attitude to a degree. I see a lot of good CEOs of banks and big corporations now coming together, talking about stakeholder responsibility, not just shareholder responsibility. That is translating into new policies that are addressing these inequities of who suffers the impact of some of these choices. So we just have to put it front and center in the dialogue, and I believe there are plenty of ways for us to address it, as long as we're addressing climate change. And I mean, I'll give you an example, folks. We've got to get a rapid transformation of our transportation sector. 28% of all emissions are transportation. 28% of the other emissions of emissions are the power production, the production for power, coal-fired power plants, so forth, oil, et cetera. That's over 50% right there. Then you add to that the next biggest, which is industry, and that's about 22%. We've got to bring all of those guys together at the table. This is the job of a president of the United States. The power of convening is half the power of the presidency. You bring your auto dealers into the White House, you talk about the science for an hour or so, and then you look at them and say, okay, guys, we can't take 20 years to become electric transportation. We got to do it in the next 5 or 10. We have to win a war. We have to treat this like it is a war. I really believe that. That's why it's called World War Zero. There's a good book out by Paul Kennedy, a professor at Yale, called Engineers of Victory. And it writes about the 4 or 5 key decisions that had to be made to win World War II that weren't made until you got between 1943 and 44. We didn't know we were going to win the war at 43. We believed we would, but we didn't know it. So those decisions were made, folks. How to gain control of the oceans, how to gain control of the air, how to penetrate the defensive forces that Hitler had built along the coastline, how you move a whole army, and big decisions. We have to do that about how we're going to get electric cars faster, and that will address part of your question, because we're clearly going to have to help people at the bottom rung of the economic ladder to be able to buy those cars and to be able to have access to that transportation. You can't have 2 systems in America for that. But I believe we could move much faster than we're talking about. We're going to have to we're going to have to decarbonize the production of electricity. You're going to have a massive amount of charging stations, so all those people who are driving those cars can charge them without polluting. But it's all doable. There's one thing I just talked about that isn't doable, but it will require massive organizing of government and business together to make it happen. Similarly, there are all kinds of things we can do in agriculture, things we can do in buildings. Buildings are about 12% of source of emissions, commercial and residential. So we're not going to do it, folks, if we do it the way we're doing it now, which is not to do it, not to even get anything done in Washington. Washington is so broken, it's disgusting. And everybody ought to be angry enough that if we're not getting people who are responding to what we need to change the people. That's what you do in a democracy. And that's where we are today.
Thank you. I'm going to take your question, and then I'll go back here.
Hello, my name is Zabib Naguse. I'm a second year in the college. My question has to do with campaign finance reform, and I'm personally of the belief that as long as oil companies, natural gas companies, coal companies are able to pump in millions of dollars into buying out politicians, into running all of these fake advertisements, that nothing is ever going to get done. So I was wondering if you agree, and if so, how do you fix it?
Well, I don't agree that nothing's ever going to get done until you do that. But I do agree that we have to do. Look, I have been for getting the big money out of American politics since I got in. I ran the first campaign for the United States Senate in which both candidates, at one point, the governor of Massachusetts and I, squaring off, both agreed on how much money we would spend and put a structure into that race where we could limit the amount of money that was spent by outside people. We had no outside expenditures. I also, for 18 years, never took a political action committee check, never took a dime from corporate. I raised my money from individuals. And the reason it was only 18 years out of 28 is, I said, when we get a campaign finance reform passed, then I will live by those rules. We got it with McCain-Feingold, and we passed something. It soon got subverted by the Supreme Court and the Citizens United decision. But there's a reason Donald Trump could run around the country saying, hey, the system is rigged, because the system is rigged. I was on the Finance Committee. I can show you a ream of books that go up to here above my head from this floor, filled with pages of tax breaks. How many of you have your own page in the tax code? Oh, wow, nobody here. No, I'm not surprised, obviously. But just think about this. Those pages belong to a lot of people with power who managed to get the lobbyists to work for them and get senators and congressmen to pass those pages. It's disgusting. The tax code of our country is a disgrace. And it's how billionaires could pay less tax rate than the average person in our country. That's a disgrace. And so we got to win that back. Now, look, if you say, well, we got to get the money out first, that's not going to happen. That just isn't going to happen. You got to be realistic. We have to elect people who want to put that change in place. When Clinton got elected, Bill Bradley and Joe Biden and I went down to the Oval Office. We had the Senate, the House, and the presidency. And we sat in the Oval Office, just the three of us with Bill Clinton, and we said, Mr. President, you've got to do campaign finance reform. This is the moment. Do it before you raise health care, because you won't get health care if you don't do it. And he said, well, that's an interesting argument. I think I'll take that under advisement. We left the White House encouraged that, oh boy, we're going to get this. Well, Tom Foley, the Speaker of the House, came down and told him, my chairman don't want to do this thing. We can't do campaign finance reform. And they didn't do it. Lost opportunity for America. And in fact, Tom Foley lost his seat, lost the speakership, wasn't even reelected to the Congress that year, partly because of that. And they didn't get health care because the powerful interests had the ability to win the day. So I know this. I've seen this movie, folks. And what we got to do is go out and create this movement this year. Donald Trump actually is helpful to us. He ought to be creating the biggest movement for reclaim of America in history. And you all have to be the agents of that. We got to get that youth vote up to 40, 50, 60%, and we will win. I absolutely guarantee you, if we do that hard work of democracy, we're going to win. That's how you get the change.
I would be remiss if I didn't put a plug in for our U-Chi Elect program, U-Chi Vote program. U-Chi Vote, we upped our turnout here on this campus dramatically in the midterm elections, and we're hopeful to do even better next year. So please keep your eyes open for announcements relative to that. It's important. Yes. Thank you for your question. Yes.
Thank you, sir, for all your great talks and all your service. We really appreciate you taking our questions.
I'm sorry that we're time limited. I apologize.
Yeah, and I appreciate the Bill Clinton accent. I actually worked for him for a short period, and that was spot on. My name is Vin Mather.
I know where that came from. I don't do that usually.
My name is Vin Mather. I'm a physician and fellow at the university's hospital here. Just two quick questions for you. You know, it's very concerning in the news right now, as you discussed, the concern for foreign interference in the elections, current and past. What do you say to people who give the counterpoint that the Hillary campaign and the Democrats did fund Christopher Steele, who was a British intelligence agent, who sourced information from Russia to track the Trump campaign? And second quick question, and I'm not a lawyer, but in terms of Mueller saying he's not exonerated, what do you think about the counterpoint where people say, you know, you're innocent until proven guilty, and prosecutors do not say you're innocent or exonerated, they just say there's no enough information to say you're arrested or indicted or guilty?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the last part of that.
What do you say to people, you mentioned Bob Mueller saying he's not exonerated, but the basic premise is that you're innocent until proven otherwise in America.
Sure.
So if a prosecutor doesn't say you're innocent, doesn't say you're exonerated, they either say there's enough information to proceed because you may be guilty, but they don't necessarily say you're innocent. That's just presumed. So what do you say to that when Bob Mueller was saying, oh, I'm not saying he's guilty of obstruction of justice, but I'm not saying he's innocent?
Well,
it's not his job.
Yeah, I think Bob was just trying to walk a line of leaving it to the Congress and other people to make the judgment, but I think the evidence is pretty clear. Look, when you tell your counsel in the White House counsel, that you ask him to falsify documents, and he says, no, I'm not going to do that, and he admits that he didn't do it, that's attempted obstruction of justice. When you fire the FBI director because of Russia and you tell the Russians, oh, I got rid of this problem, blah, 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 that's obstruction of justice. I mean, there are 10 very clear instances of obstruction. And, you know, it's not Mueller's job. He doesn't sit there and say, oh, he's guilty to do that. He didn't have the right to, he didn't have that opening legitimately under the directive with which he was hired to do the job. So other people have to do their jobs, and I think that's doable personally. But let me come back, and the first part of your question was on the
Steele.
Oh, on the Steele dossier. Look, the Steele dossier was the product of a group of conservatives who hated Donald Trump and feared his winning the nomination during the time that there was still a primary in the Republican Party. Go back and look at all the things that Lindsey Graham said about Trump. Look at the things that Jeb Bush said, that Marco Rubio said, that run the list of them. Those things didn't suddenly change, folks. It's the people who said it who changed. And the fact is, that dossier was paid for and begun by the people who were trying to take down Donald Trump. And when that failed, yes, it became available to the Clinton campaign, and the Clinton campaign used it. It's opposition research. It's not a pretty part of American politics, opposition research. But it should be kept within the purview of Americans to both do it and use it, not for foreign countries to be held up and to have the security of our country put at risk as a result of a president seeking to get that country to become the opposition research arm. It's against the law. So I see divisions here, real changes here. The conservatives who make the argument and the people who make the argument on Fox News never acknowledge that it came from them, from their folks, from their side. They're the ones who began it. And it's part of the fake news distortions that we wrestle with today.
Thank you, sir.
Can we, just one more
Yes,
question
ma'am.
over here.
Hi, my name is Veena Krishnan, and I'm a first-year MBA candidate at Booth. I had a question about like solar and wind power as we look towards those as and electric vehicles as a mean to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels. What is your idea, or do you think there's a risk associated with that, given that our electrical infrastructure, like substations, et cetera, has been neglected for the past several decades, and how do we kind of combat that?
Well, we have to build out a grid. You know, this is one of the things that astounds me, and I don't understand it, honestly. The Acela train that I mentioned a little while ago can't go fast under the Baltimore tunnel because the vibrations might have the tunnel cave in on you. The train can't go fast over those rickety old bridges of the Chesapeake because it may wind up in the Chesapeake. I mean, folks, we're not behaving like the country that we are. You go to LaGuardia today and you see a lot of build out. That's the Port Authority trying to do that. Jerry Brown was trying to create a high-speed rail in California. He can't do that on his own. The last big project in America actually went to Boston. It's called the Big Dig. And we tore down this horrible green overpass and connected our city to the harbor. I mean, how much is that worth? A lot more than the current price, of what it would cost to do that. So my point to you is that we have to be a country that believes in ourselves again and begins to make decisions for the long term. We're living off what our parents did for us and our grandparents did for us. You know, the great highways of our nation, Dwight Eisenhower did that, part of the defense structure. The great bridges in New York and San Francisco and various places. Go back to the New Deal, to the WPA for some of the great works projects that we still are living off of. We're not investing in the future. And so, but we're the richest nation on the face of the planet. Other people are. Russia, China is spending $1 trillion right now on the Belt and Road program, touching 70 different nations with projects that they're investing in. They're putting $500 billion into building research laboratories in each of the countries that they touch. We're not even in the game. $1 trillion, you know what the entire budget of the State Department is for embassies and aid, USAID, the whole deal? $51 billion. And it's been $51 billion for the last, I don't know how many years. So folks, we've got to begin to behave like the country that we think we are and want to be in the future. And that means investing in it. There are all kinds of ways to do this, really. I was on the super committee of the United States Congress that had an opportunity to try to create a budget deal where we could have had tax reform and we could have dealt with entitlements for the long haul and really put ourselves on a sound footing for the future and invest in infrastructure. And Fred Upton, a Republican congressman from Michigan, wanted to do this. We were talking about doing it together. David Camp, the Republican chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, wanted to do this. You know what prevented it? A congressman from Texas who was one of those right-wing ideologues named Jeb Hensarling, who refused to let the committee take it up and be responsible. Ideology got in the way. So folks, we are a democracy, so-called. Winston Churchill said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for everything else. And it's not perfect, but nothing will stop any one of you from going out and running or organizing, going street to street, making sure everybody you talk to, you make sure they vote, you do this. Nothing's preventing you from doing that. We are not the prisoners of climate change unless we do not exercise our will. It's not a question of capacity, it's a question of will. There's been no will to do these things. How can we have a Congress in which there are 130 deniers of climate change? How? Well, so it was 12 back in 1970 with the Dirty Dozen. Let's have 130 this time. I mean, let's go out and do the work of doing this. Democracy's hard work. There's no automatic pilot for it. And when you have only 55.6% people voting in a presidential race with as much at stake as was at stake in 2016, you can look in the mirror, you can look at your kids, you can look at our family members to find out where the problem is. Truly I'm an optimist, but only because we can do it, not because I know we're gonna. And that's why I'm working so hard to make sure we do.
We are flashing red here, so I have to apologize to all those who've been patiently waiting to ask questions. I want to repeat UCHI votes. Whatever your point of view is, you need to participate in this democracy. The author, one of the authors of Why Democracies Die will be here later this quarter, so we're going to have that discussion. And the last thing, and I hope you don't mind me sharing this, the Secretary said, I have a bit of a cold. I hope there are good microphones because I want to make sure people can hear me. I think you were well heard, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you all.